Hi everyone. I thought I'd go a few minutes early just to make sure the audio works this time. So we'll just give everyone else a few minutes. So please keep your questions coming. I am reading them as you're adding them in. Let me know as well if the audio isn't very good this time. I know the philosophy one, it wasn't very clear at the beginning anyway. Yeah, that's fine, Mia. Audio's good. Fabulous. Thanks, Mia. Well, I'll quickly go over my thoughts from the philosophy exam just while we wait for everybody else to join us. The philosophy exam, I thought in general was not too bad. I thought the philosophy exam wasn't too bad, minus the Anselm question. I thought that was really mean. So because of how specific Anselm was in an already tricky topic, I can't help but think, as many of you have already gathered, I think guilt might be on this year for Anselm and Aquinas. That's worst case scenario. Anselm for me was worst case scenario philosophy, so we need to prepare for that. It might not be, but we will go over it and work out a few ways of doing it together shortly. I thought the others were fine because at the end of the day, OCR have to still test you. You have to remember that. They have to test you in order to be able to do fair grade boundaries. So I know a lot of students weren't happy with them specifically saying the fifth way, but that was to help create grade boundaries so that students had to use their knowledge to work out what is the fifth way. Is it teleological or is it cosmological? So I think the rest of them were fair, minus Anselm. So we'll have a look in a second once we get going as far as ethics. Thanks, Abby. Death and Afterlife's not on this, and not on the spec for DCT either. Abby, I find a lot of students that did do the Anselm question absolutely smashed it. So from what I've heard from what students have written for Anselm, they've done brilliantly well. But I would class that. I think nature of God is by far the hardest philosophy topic. So, and I think Anselm's four-dimensionist approach is so specific and quite a tricky one, but the students that have done it from the bits I've heard have done fantastically well. So yeah, the Anselm was done very well. I just think it was mean, which means that we can also do really well on the guilt one if it's on. Taylor, the predictions for this one are also on the blog, so just check out the blog. I think therefore I teach. The predictions are top of the blog, and with a couple of old posts underneath to help with ethics as well. So they're all on there, but I'll probably link them in as I talk tonight as well. Right, we are on 6 o'clock, so we might as well get going. I think as far as your exam tomorrow, you are going to get 4 questions, one on meta, one on conscience, one on sex, one on euthanasia. I very much doubt you will get 2 questions on the same area. I don't think they will do that. It's not OCR's style, but they could do. But I think you'll get 1 question on each of those areas. For meta ethics, I think that they will either ask you a question that looks at using the words objective factual approach, which means ethical naturalism and intuitionism, or you might get one on ethical naturalism on its own because that's never been asked before, which I think is doable. As far as meta-ethics is concerned, the main things to remember is your cognitive, objective, factual approaches are both ethical naturalism and intuitionism. The other thing to remember with meta-ethics is that emotivism is A.J. Ayer's, as in A.J. Ayer, the king of verification. He is interested in verification. He's interested in analytic and synthetic statements. He's interested in statements of fact. And so he just says, understanding ethical statements is just on the side. They're just emotions. So he's kind of like pushing them aside. They weren't his main focus. ethical naturalism, like Bradley or Philippa Four, are really supporting it and pushing it forward. G. Moore's really pushing intuitionism, whereas A.J. Ayer is just saying, let's focus on analytic synthetic propositions of truth, and emotivism is just a side thing that he's saying, this is just where we are for or against something, boo hurrah theory, that sort of thing. So it's good to keep A.J. Ayer in a context of what his focus was there. So as far as the question that I've been asked quite a lot online, is the one about, is good the defining question in ethics? The main thing you have to remember for metaethics is the whole point of metaethics in the first place is, what is the meaning of ethical terms? What do ethical terms actually mean? So normative ethics, normative is your natural law, your Kant utilitarianism, that's what things are right and wrong. So for natural law, murder goes against the first primary precept, therefore is wrong. What metaethics says is, let's not focus on the murder, let's focus on the wrong. What does wrong mean? What does good mean, bad mean? So all the three approaches in metaethics look at, what do the words actually mean? So a question like, good is the defining question in ethics, it is the defining question. How can you apply ethics? How can you understand ethics if you don't understand what the words mean in the first place to then apply them? So it is the defining question for ethics, but it just depends which approach does it right. Is it ethical naturalism as far as defining it as far as naturalism is concerned? Is it intuition? Is it just an instinct, a common sense? It's a response that you just know, or is it an emotional response? So those are kind of the main things for metaethics that I wanted to make sure I covered with you. Let me just seeing if there's any questions on metaethics that are popping up. If you've got a question on metaethics, just pop it in now, and then we can feel like we've done metaethics. So if there's any metaethics questions, so I'll try and keep it a bit more ordered tonight. So I'll do metaethics first, I'll then go over euthanasia, then I'll do sex, then I'll do conscience last. So we'll try and keep it in a kind of order, just so that I can control the questions and I don't miss anything. Right, so how would you describe metaethics through naturalism? Naturalism, find the definition online. There's a great definition online, but basically naturalism is the idea that you have within nature propositions. A proposition is a statement of truth. And so you normally have analytic and synthetic propositions. So you know this from philosophy. These are propositions, statements of truth that are based on fact, and those facts you can find within nature. Ethical naturalism argues ethics are also part of that. Ethics, ethical statements, anything good, bad, right, wrong, are also just like analytic and synthetic statements. So don't forget, an analytic statement is a statement of fact based on definition. Bachelors are unmarried men. Synthetic, you can find evidence to back it up, and normally they're on their own. Whereas ethical naturalism goes, no, ethical statements should also be in there as well, because you can find enough evidence to back up a statement, so that when you say someone is good, bad, right, or wrong, you're basing that on evidence. And so therefore that evidence is factual, just like the evidence you would have in a synthetic statement. So it's the idea that this then becomes objective truths, where you've used the natural world to find facts to back things up. So the easiest thing to do for metaethics is establish what perspective you are. Are you an ethical naturalist? Are you an intuitionist? Or are you an emotivist? As in, think about something that really gets you to the core. It might be, you might be vegan, and the idea of eating animals just is something you're really passionate about. Maybe it might be why torture is bad, or about abortion or euthanasia. Think about something you're really passionate about, and really passionately believe it's either right or wrong, good or bad. How do you then make that judgment? How do you make that judgment on a statement like that? That's how you work out which approach you take. So if you believe something is bad and you back it up with evidence, you're an ethical naturalist. If you just know it's bad, you're an intuitionist. If you have an emotional response, a feeling, then you're an emotivist. Must you include all the theories in a metaethics question? No, absolutely not. It depends on what the question is. If the question is general on good, bad, right, and wrong, then you could bring in all three or a couple. If it's specific on a theory, which often it is, so intuitionism or motivism or ethical naturalism, you could bring both of them in to compare it. You could bring one in to compare, or you could just do an essay on that one area in the question. So you do not have to mention all three. It just depends how you wish to answer the question most easily. Ria, yes, you're right. Aya said it isn't the defining study of ethics. But if the question is the question was about the defining question in it, so you could definitely link Aya in that sense. But I don't know what Aya would say is the defining thing of ethics. Then I think that's linking into the ideas that it's not of crucial importance because we should focus on analytic and synthetic rather than emotional responses to things. And A is probably also considering the fact that everybody's emotional response will be different. So therefore, it's not the defining question in that sense because it's always going to be subjective. So I imagine he's coming at it from that angle. How does Bradley differ from Philippa Foot? Thank you, Oliver. Bradley focuses mainly on and he's more the instigator of the argument. He focuses on the terms good, bad, right, and wrong, whereas Philippa Foot gives examples of honesty, and she gives more examples. So it's not really that they're different. Philippa Foot kind of adds to Bradley. She supports Bradley, so she adds to his argument. So she talks about an honest person. She gives the anthropologist as an example. So she's more extending Bradley than being different to Bradley. Predictions are on the blog. Mackie's criticism of naturalism, Isabel, run that by me. I don't know what that one is, or can't recall it. Virtue ethics through Philippa Foot does link with naturalism, but you don't have to. Virtue ethics is old spec, not new spec, so you don't have to know virtue ethics. Good if you do, though, because it's a bit of wider understanding. If you didn't answer the question correctly, but you write a successful essay, I don't know how you would write a successful essay if you don't answer the question. So I don't quite know how you would. Answering the question is the key thing. So if you get a question and you pick the wrong topic, so the way that you interpret the question, you write about the wrong area. As long as you specifically answer the question and show how everything you're writing is to the question, they'll then give you marks. But you can't write a successful answer without answering the question. Martha, I don't think so. I think cognitive, non-cognitive, just knowing the meaning of things like naturalism, I think those are the main things, and knowing which names go with which argument. I'd say those are the main things for that one. You don't need, thank you, Rupert, you do not need to bring normative into methics. They are two completely separate arguments. So you could bring meta into your sex ethics question if that works for you, but I would not bring normative into a meta ethics. I think that meta ethics needs to be discussed on its own with the three meta ethics arguments. I wouldn't bring normative in unless it was just to make a passing comment about how you need to understand the words in order to be applied them, such as, and then just give a quick sentence to explain. But you don't need to talk about normative in a meta ethics answer. More or Hume a stronger argument against? I'm guessing you mean the naturalistic fallacies. When it comes to the naturalistic fallacies or the is or argument, what I've recommended to my students is to focus on the G.E. Moore one rather than the Hume one, because they're pretty much the same argument. You're just going to repeat yourself again. So I pick the G.E. Moore naturalistic fallacy because in that way you can then you can say what ethical naturalism is, use the naturalistic fallacy against it, and then say what G.E. Moore's variation was or response answer was. So I find the naturalistic fallacy is a nice link between criticizing ethical naturalism to then introduce G.E. Moore's argument. He criticized ethical naturalism to then bring in his own argument. So that works really nicely, I find. Don't forget as well, naturalistic fallacy. Fallacy is a fault in logic. And so the fault in logic here is saying ethics are part of naturalism. That's why it's called the naturalistic fallacy, is that you can't take from an is a factual statement about the world to how you ought to behave, and if you do, you're committing a fallacy. So that's where it's called naturalistic fallacy. Right, I'm going to move on to euthanasia. So I'm going to move on to euthanasia. If you, again, keep your meta-ethics questions coming, but obviously it's hard for me to talk and read at the same time, and I want to make sure I cover plenty with you all. So I'm happy to go back to anything meta-ethics if you do have any other questions. Okay, so as far as sex ethics is concerned, euthanasia, we'll do euthanasia first. As far as euthanasia is concerned, I think you're going to get a specific question on euthanasia. I don't think they're going to ask you one specifically on natural law or situation ethics. I think that you could still bring those arguments in, but I don't think the question will be specific natural law situation ethics. Why? Because they were on the advanced information. It said euthanasia. So because of that, there's a lot of gaps that haven't been asked before. You have not been asked sanctity of life in the 21st century, sanctity of life, quality of life, and you've not been asked about medical intervention and medical non-intervention. So I think that you're going to get a question on these areas. If you do, you can still bring natural law and situation ethics in, but the focus is on the question and what they're asking for. So the main things to remember for those is that sanctity of life, if it says religious concept of sanctity of life is foundational in religious ideas. Religions such as Christianity believe wholeheartedly in the sanctity of life because of the Imago Dei, spark of divinity, made in the image of God, all of that. That is why it is so important for Christians. But you can believe in sanctity of life and not be a Christian. It's not just a religious concept. You can believe that life is sacred and life has worth and meaning and importance and not be a Christian. So you need to explore how natural law talks about sanctity of life, or life being sacred. But don't forget, natural law was designed for both atheists and religious believers and Christians. That's why Aquinas created natural law in the first place, to avoid the divine command theory. The divine command theory just said, God tells you what's right and wrong, so you do it. And Aquinas went, but what happens if people don't believe in God? Are they automatically then immoral? And he said, no, that doesn't work. That's why he created the natural law theory, to say, here is a theory that explains why everybody can be ethical. Believing in God helps, but everybody can be ethical. So in that sense, sanctity of life, all life being sacred, his first primary precept of preserving life, is both from a religious understanding, but also from an understanding of, everybody can understand that, everyone can take and follow that. Same as situation ethics. Situation ethics started as a religious Christian idea based on St. Paul, Jesus, etc. But don't forget, Joseph Fletcher lost his Christianity. He maintained situation ethics, but he lost his faith. But the argument still works. So if you get a question on the religious concept, don't forget, you can talk about the fact that there's many layers to sanctity of life. It isn't just all life is sacred, and this is what Christians argue. There is so much more to it than that. If you get a question on medical intervention versus medical non-intervention, medical intervention can be seen as active euthanasia. That's when you're medically intervening, or you're doing things like pacemakers, defibrillators. You're medically intervening to save someone's life, or potentially to end someone's life. And so you would weigh that up. Medical non-intervention means that medicine is not intervening. So you are not having another round of chemotherapy. You're not having a feeding tube. So that's more your passive euthanasia link. So you could get a question on that area and get to explore them. And you're just looking again at whether medical intervention is good, right, whether you should do it. So, for example, Aquinas' natural law is very much against the idea of active euthanasia, but then again, pacemakers is medical intervention, but supports the first primary precept. So, the main thing I say for my students for euthanasia is you're meant to have competing arguments. You're meant to say the doctrine of double effect says this, but then apparent good says this, but then first primary precept says this, but then this differs with this. You're not meant to just have one clear answer for natural law. You're meant to look at the layers of how it can be approached in different ways. That makes the good answers. Right, how are we doing with euthanasia? The textbook says naturalistic fallacy is that it's a mistake to try to find good in terms of something else, in some things else. Freddie, trying to define good in terms of naturalism, nature, objective truths within the world. That's what naturalistic fallacy is pointing out, that the mistake has been made. So they believe good is through intuition, not through objective facts about the world. That should help there. Yeah, good question, Liz. How can you follow natural law if you don't believe in God? Aquinas, that would be a weakness of natural law, but you could still believe that you have reason to work out right and wrong. You could still believe in rector ratio. You could still believe in the 5 primary precepts, maybe not the 5th one, worshipping God, but a lot of you will believe preservation of life, reproduction, order, society, education as fundamental principles of existence. And so the doctrine of double effect, these ideas, yes, you maybe don't link it to God has given you those, but everyone, you could still follow it. You're probably not going to. That's not the point I'm trying to say. You're probably not going to, but it's just about understanding that even if you want to criticize natural law, Aquinas is trying to create a theory where everyone can follow it, even if they don't believe God was the source of reason. He still believes we all are given the gift of reason, for example. Situation ethics links to medical intervention and medical non-intervention. You could argue it either way. At the end of the day, the core structure of situation ethics is agape. So if the most loving thing is medical intervention, that's the most loving thing to do. If it's medical non-intervention, that's the most loving thing to do. A good way of doing that is to use case studies. I highly advise you to remember your case studies. So I cover Tony Nicholson. We look at Tracy Latimore's case in America. Know Baby Charlotte's case. Know Baby Alfie. So know your different cases, or any that you've done. You might have done Diane Pretty, for example. So know the cases that you've done, because that again helps apply the theories to them as far as medical intervention and medical non-intervention. For situation ethics as well, have a rough idea of your 6 and your 4. So your 4 working principles, for example. So know your 6 and your 4, so that you can apply parts of them as well to what it is you're talking about. Explain the doctrine of double effect quickly. So the doctrine of double effect is the idea that you can never do bad intentionally. So you can't kill Hitler, even if the outcome meant you saved millions. You can never do bad intentionally. But sometimes bad things happen. But if your intention is genuine and true, doctrine of double effect is to explain why bad things can happen. So if you're genuinely, and don't forget, God knows, if your genuine intention is to help ease someone's pain by giving them morphine, but then they happen to die because the morphine kills them, that's the doctrine of double effect. You did not try and kill them. You did not try and euthanize them. This is purely the fact that somebody has died, but your intention was to try and ease their pain. So the doctrine of double effect is to explain why bad things sometimes happen, but it's not on the person morally responsible, because their intention was genuine and true. Okay, Lara, you've asked that question a couple of times, so I'll just quickly answer that one. And I'll move on to sex ethics. So when it comes to sex ethics, it's specified just sex ethics. It didn't mention the arguments. However, so there's many questions you could get in sex ethics. You could get an open topic area. No ethical theory is useful when dealing with issues in sex ethics. You could get a question like that. You could get a specific one on Kant or utilitarianism or natural or situation ethics. Again, I doubt it because they didn't specify it. But you can't do sex ethics without knowing your application arguments. So I think what they will do is they will ask an open theory, something like no ethical theory is helpful when dealing with, and then I think they're going to be specific on the sex part. So I think they're going to say homosexuality, premarital or extramarital. So I think they're going to be specific on the theme and keep the topic open. So you will still need to know one or two topics to be able to apply, but your job tonight probably is to make sure you have enough to talk about as far as homosexuality, premarital and extramarital sex. I would also make sure you know a couple of dates and legislation, how homosexuality laws have changed over time. What are our premarital laws? And don't forget, if it comes at it from a religious perspective, so religious perspective for premarital sex or extramarital or homosexuality, often students, religious beliefs and practices is one of the parts of it. Don't forget, students always go down the attack Christianity. Christianity only brought in the idea of monogamous marriage, so don't have sex before marriage, to protect women. If women were having sex outside of marriage, people wouldn't have married them. And so, yes, it's a very archaic understanding now for today, but that's why Christianity promotes don't have sex before marriage, so that you are, there's just one partner and you're with them. And as a woman, culturally, back in the day when it was written, you are then protected in society, which is why, again, they said the husbands can't divorce. Once you're married to that woman, and that's it. You can't divorce them, because what was happening culturally was men were sleeping with women and then moving on, and that woman then is unmarriable. Women that weren't virgins couldn't be married, or they're very hard to marry. And so Christianity came in and said, no, if you want to be with that woman, you will marry them. You will not have sex before marriage. You will marry them, and then you will not divorce them when you want to move on to somebody else. And so all of these were to protect women, because virginity was seen as so important back in those days. Yes, it's very out of date. You can argue that, but that was the crux of where the beliefs came from, even if they need to be updated now, which they are. One of the churches, I think it's Church of England or Methodist, talks about cohabitation. They understand living together and things like that. So there's flexibility within the denominations, but don't automatically go on the attack Christianity. Think about it in maybe a few deeper layers as well. Concubines. They had a lot of concubines. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for the dates there. They're excellent. Deontological approaches are better than teleological approaches. I don't think that wording's on the spec. If it is on the spec, teleologicals, utilitarianism, deontologicals, natural law or Kant, situation ethics is teleological as well. So you just pick one from each side and use them against each other. So that's fairly doable. Yep, Dr. Shipman for misuse of euthanasia, excellent. That's why it became illegal in this country as well to euthanize. And euthanasia used to be legal until Harold Shipman misused it. So that's a good way of talking about it, definitely. Yes, Isabel, it could ask you on the spec. It does say about how views have developed over time and changed over time. Again, I think that's quite a mean, hard question. So I'll just make sure you have an idea of how homosexuality, know a few things about countries as well. So what countries say about homosexuality. So whilst we are extremely open now and our laws support and promote and understand homosexual relationships, this is not the same in other countries. So again, you've got a good comparison there as well. Another question that I get asked quite often is whether, if you get an open topic and specific on homosexuality, if you do all 4 topics as a chunk and link them across to homosexuality, you could do. I don't advise it. doing natural law homosexuality, situation ethics homosexuality, it's boring even just talking about it. You'll be bored writing it. Any essays where you get some sort of comparison are so much better. So I would say use your theories against each other. If you're saying natural law doesn't work for homosexuality or whatever the theme is, say an argument that is better than and why it's better. And then say another one that might be, or another flaw with natural law and why something else avoids that. So I would always keep within either, as long as the question allows it, I'd only keep 2 theories at any point. I would never try and do 3 or 4 of the theories. I would go with one topic if you get to choose, one topic you think's really good and one you think doesn't work at all, and use them against each other with the theme in the middle of homosexuality, premarital, extramarital. If you get to choose, just rotate your themes, or the question might be very specific on which one you need to use throughout. If the question specifically says premarital sex, you must only talk about premarital sex. Don't talk about anything else. So if the question is something like, Kant is the best approach to sex ethics, it could be. Don't think it will, but if it could be, then you need to focus on Kant. You could get full marks, A star, without mentioning any other theory. If the question is Kant is the best approach, you can say whether it is or is not the best approach on its own. If you do want to compare it to another theory, though, do it at the end of the paragraph. Do not do a whole other paragraph on another theory. So do situation ethics. If the question situation ethics is the best approach, do situation ethics point, link it to your sex theme, evaluate it, and then say which theory in the same paragraph is better or worse. So that's how you would do it, all in one paragraph. Chances are, if you're doing a compare question or where you're looking at 2 arguments, you'll be looking at 3 paragraphs, 3, maybe 4 paragraphs. That would be it, because they'll be a lot longer in length. Yep, freedom of your body, John Stuart Mill on Liberty. Yep, very, very good, Ollie. John Stuart Mill talks about some excellent links from John Stuart Mill. He talks about autonomy. A lot of them, all the arguments focus on consent. Consent is so important. And so again, even if premarital sex isn't against Christianity, for example, it might be against consent, because most of the arguments would argue that you are not of the age of consent before 16, for example. So that's what our law supports as well, that you shouldn't be having sex before 16. So it's all to do with the ideas of consent. Can somebody that's 14, 13 really consent properly? So consent is very important. Autonomy, free choice is very important. So yeah, great point, Ollie, on the freedom over your body idea there. In extramarital sex, can you talk about premarital? Depends if the question specifically on extramarital, I don't know how you'd link premarital in. Extramarital, you want to be talking about concubines, you want to be talking about how the Bible, extramarital sex, things like the surrogate story, how they were able to, in the Bible, have sex with someone else in order to surrogate a baby. How extramarital, again, is to, goes against consent, maybe link it to the ideas of pleasure and happiness for utilitarianism, that yes, you might have a couple that are happy in the affair, but what about the ripple effect of all the family that's affected? So you've got more people unhappy than the couple that are in it. So again, I would try and, if it's on extramarital, stick with extramarital. Could you do a whole paragraph on another approach if it's better, as long as you evaluate against the name? You could do. What I would then highly advise is, if the question is on natural law and you want to say utilitarianism is better or worse, you've done your natural law paragraph, you've linked it to whatever you needed to link it and evaluated it. Don't then start your next paragraph jumping straight into utilitarianism argues, because as soon as you do that, an examiner will think, questions on natural law, why they're bringing in utilitarianism. Do an opening sentence that says, in order to really explore natural law and its flaws, or to really explore natural law and why it works, let's explore utilitarianism. Utilitarianism argument of hedonic calculus works better than natural law because, or doesn't work because. So you would have to really make sure that natural law is still the focus. It's never on the other argument. So that's the best way of doing it. Yep, Sodom and Gomorrah's homosexuality, Freddie, correct. So it's for Sodom and Gomorrah, you need to know that story, but you need to know how the understanding of that story has also changed. So Sodom and Gomorrah was never really against homosexuality. It's been used to promote homophobia, but the Bible itself, the story itself, never really is against homosexuality. It was against the villagers wanting to kind of violate the guests of this person's house. Don't forget as well, just as a complete side point, the story after Sodom and Gomorrah is about incest. So it's the ideas that we focus so much on the Sodom and Gomorrah and use this to promote homophobia, yet the next story is completely immoral, yet we seem to completely ignore that. So you can use this to layer how it's not necessarily the Bible's fault. The Bible is just talking about stories at the time. It's how people have used these stories to promote their own prejudices. And so it's the people's fault rather than the Bible itself's fault, or the church has used it. But if you want to argue the church has promoted homophobia, you have to back it up with examples. So knowing something from the Pope, Pope Francis has made a few mistakes when it comes to his statements about homosexuality, but he's tried to correct them. Somebody posted, I think that someone posted something earlier about one of the Methodist churches has now changed for same-sex marriage. There's a lot going on at the moment with the church and same-sex marriage. I think somewhere in Scotland has just allowed the first same-sex marriage in a church. I don't know which denomination it was. You need to know these things. You have to know what's going on, because you can't let your views of Christianity, you can't let your understandings of it influence how you write without backing it up with truths and with statements of fact. So you have to back it up with, if you want to argue that Christianity has promoted homophobia, for example, you have to say why. How are you making that judgment? If a question didn't specify normative, do you have to mention them all? No. So again, just rewatch back a little bit, but no, I would stick with 2. Irini, that one is the story I'm talking about. The Sodom and Gomorrah, it's Lot and his 2 daughters that go into the mountains afterwards. That's the story after Sodom and Gomorrah. So that's the story you're thinking of. Kyle, utilitarianism and Kant, absolutely not in euthanasia. They are not part of euthanasia at all. Only natural law and situation, I think, should be used. Absolutely not. Even synoptically, I would say avoid utilitarianism and Kant, because you're not expected to make those links. Any other questions about either sex ethics, euthanasia, or meta before I start on conscience? So any other questions on those areas? Private versus public. It's a naff question, isn't it? Private versus public. Again, if you get a question on something like that and you think, what on earth do I talk about? Just think, right, I need to apply some theories. I'm going to pick, again, just go into that exam knowing. So for me, I like Kant and natural law. Don't judge me. I like Kant and natural law because they're black and white. They're clear. They're structured. Even if I don't like the answer they give me, at least they give me an answer. Utilitarianism, I like in general, but as far as an argument, I could argue why utilitarianism doesn't work, and situation ethics I don't think works that well. So I would go into the exam knowing where I fall. So if I got a random question like private versus public in sex ethics, I'd think, right, I'm going to argue Kant and I'm going to argue utilitarianism. So how could I apply these approaches? So private, you could talk about homosexuality, premarital, extramarital sex. You could talk about how homosexuality behind private doors where you're not affecting anybody else in society, should it then just be part of the law? If people are practicing and don't hurt anybody else, is that allowed? Or would, for example, Kant would support that view, consent, etc. Whereas utilitarianism just promotes pleasure. But what happens if you're doing the pleasure publicly, like 2 men kissing in Saudi Arabia? You'll be arrested because it's against the law. So I would just kind of, if I got a question like that, I would keep 2 theories focused and just talk about the different ways that the themes premarital, extramarital, or homosexuality can be linked to private and public and what each would say. But I think it's a bit of a, it's a bit naff. Bit of a naff area, sorry. So that one, I don't think you would be expected to jump through certain hoops with that. I think it would just be exploring the question. Categorical imperative on euthanasia, no, because it's Kant. I think it's very, very risky. I think it's very risky because it would be classed as a synoptic link. So you would, but I think by the time you've looked at euthanasia, sanctity of life, quality of life, personhood, you've looked at your key studies like Tony Nicholson, you've looked at it from potentially parts of natural law and situation ethics in some depth. You know, we don't just want, I want primary precepts, I want apparent and real good, I want rector ratio. When you've looked at things in depth for them, applied it across and evaluated it, I don't think you would need to bring in Kant or utilitarianism. I think it's very risky because you were never meant to know Kant and utilitarianism, euthanasia. Euthanasia is natural law, situation ethics. Business ethics was Kant, utilitarianism. I personally think it's very risky overlapping them. You have enough within enough within euthanasia and enough hoops to jump through with it on its own without bringing in other theories. But that's just my opinion. Autonomy for euthanasia is about free will. So it's about the free choice to end your life when you want it to. It's about your free choice to not have food if you want to die. It's your free choice about going into hospice care. So it's the free choice to preserve life through having a pacemaker. So autonomy just means the free choice. So situation ethics would support free choice because situation ethics is all about autonomy and agape. So that one is just, again, exploring the key themes of natural law and or situation ethics and how they both promote autonomy in their own way with euthanasia. Do you need to know all 4 areas for sex ethics just in case they specify one? I think so. They might say utilitarianism and sex ethics. I doubt it, but you need to know all 4 just in case they do. You do not need to talk about all 4 if the question remains open, but you need to know all 4 just in case they do specify. Could you get a question to ask to compare 2 specific theories? Thank you, Poppy. Possibly. I very much doubt it though, because I think that if you've got natural law is better than situation ethics when dealing with issues surrounding sex, the question is just, it's too much for you within 40 minutes. I think the way that they normally do it is they say things like natural law is the best approach to sex ethics, discuss, and then students bring in another theory if they wanted to compare it to. I don't think you would get two theories in one question getting you to compare to a theme within sex ethics. I think it's just too much. If you did, you do exactly the same. Whatever topic is first in the question, that's your structure. You link that question, that area to sex, and then you compare with the other one they mentioned. So it's still the same, even if they do ask a compare question. Yeah, you can disregard Kant and utilitarianism if you're not, or no, if you're answering the sex question, you could get asked on Kant and utilitarianism. If euthanasia, you don't have to know them, but for sex ethics, you do. Edward, check out the beginning of this stream to go over meta ethics questions, or check out the blog where I've put my specific predictions. How many cases do you need to know for euthanasia? I would definitely say one where somebody wanted euthanasia and wasn't euthanized, and then I would know one of the baby cases, baby Charlotte, baby Alfie, where the parents fundamentally did not want, they wanted to save their child, and the government stepped in and said, no, we will not resuscitate, you cannot take this child abroad. I think it was the baby Charlie or Alfie case. One of them, they raised money to get him revolutionary surgery to help another country. They raised money, it would have cost the taxpayers nothing, and the government said, no, we will stop you, you cannot take this child, and the child died. So it's good to know that case where on the one hand They don't allow euthanasia to the point where Tony Nicholson had to starve himself to death because he wasn't allowed youth to be euthanized, versus when parents want their babies to be resuscitated, want to save their lives, and the government say no. So it's kind of like sanctity of life. When is life sacred? Why is a baby's life not sacred, etc.? So that's good discussion. So I'd know a couple. Is this criminology? No, criminology's finished now. No more criminology. This is for philosophy. Well, ethics. No problem. The predictions are on the blog. I think therefore I teach, so it'll be the top post for the predictions. How many additional scholars? Oh, meant to include for conscience, right? I think is it time for conscience? What is that Rachel's dude saying about euthanasia? That Rachel's dude says the point that I that's one of my favourite points. The Rachel's dude, James Rachel's is the one that argues that passive euthanasia is far crueler than active. So active is like what you have at Dignitas. You go there as long as you can take the pill, take the potion, as long as you can administer it yourself, you can euthanize yourself legally in Dignitas in Switzerland. And so that's active euthanasia. You can actively euthanize yourself and painlessly when you've made that decision. Whereas we don't allow that in this country. We only allow passive, which means that you have to starve yourself to death. You have to go without treatment and die quite long and painfully. So what James Rachel's is arguing is a bit like what happened to Tony Nicholson. Tony Nicholson had locked-in syndrome, which is probably one of the most horrendous things ever. You're basically completely conscious, but you're locked in your body. You cannot move any part of your body. You are locked inside your own body. And so Tony Nicholson wanted to be euthanized. I think he could still maybe blink or something like that. So he could kind of communicate through blinking, or so there was some way of that he could communicate kind of Morse code style. And he wanted to be euthanized. And the government said, no, we euthanasia is illegal. You cannot be euthanized. And so he starved himself to death. And so he didn't eat. And I think it took about 11 days, maybe up to 2 weeks. You'd have to check the specifics. But it took that long to painfully die. And so what James Rachel's is arguing is, how is that legal? How is it legal that somebody can starve themselves to death because they're so desperate to end their life, yet you don't allow active euthanasia? Now, a lot of people say, well, can't people just do it in other ways? The point is that the law should support these people. Life is a gift, not a burden. You know, sanctity of life is important, but what about quality of life? If these people are desperate, they've got incurable diseases, there's never going to be a treatment that cures locked-in syndrome. There's never going to be a treatment that cures motor neurons disease at a certain point. And so these people are desperate, saying, just let me make that decision, let me have my last free will autonomous choice. And our government says no. And so that's what James Rachel is arguing, is that passive euthanasia is so much worse than active. Yeah, Singer links very well to quality of life. He is a huge advocate of quality of life. If a question doesn't ask about reference to a theory in euthanasia or sex ethics, you don't have to talk about them, no. If you can just talk about what it asks in the question, so sanctity of life versus quality of life, you could just answer a whole question just on that, or homosexuality. I don't even know how they'd ask, if they ask something about the practices or beliefs or something like that of sex ethics, then you don't have to mention theories unless you want to. Right, I think it's so. For euthanasia, can you say when it first arose, they didn't have science we have now? For euthanasia, can you say when it first arose, they didn't have the science we have now? I'm not sure what you mean. So you're meaning that we can do an awful lot of end of life care and an awful lot of support, which when euthanasia was legal, it was because there was no nothing to do to help these people. Yes, that's fine. But as I said, there's certain things that even science can't help with. So at that point, should you then allow euthanasia? So, but yes, no, I get what you're saying now with that. Right. It is conscience time. So conscience is the one that worries me. And I need some drink first. This has not got vodka in it, don't worry. Now, conscience is the easiest out of all the topics. It's Aquinas and Freud. That's it. You don't have to know any other names. Newman is old spec. Piaget is old spec. Fromm is old spec. You do not need to know any other names other than Aquinas and Freud. So with Aquinas and Freud, because it's so simple, I think they might ask you a hard question. As well as the only two questions that have been asked previously, they've already asked the question on Aquinas on his own and Freud on his own. Now, you might be really lucky. We might be expecting the worst, hope for the best, expect the worst. So they might ask you one on just Freud on his own or just Aquinas. I think they're going to ask you a compare. Now, a compare question is already hard. So compares are already hard because of the structure of how you will have to do them. And I'll go over the structure in a second. I don't think they will then ask you to compare guilt because it's just so tricky, but they might do. After the Anselm question, they might do. So let's go through how we would do an Aquinas versus Freud. So my advice tonight is do a little bit of wider research, do a little bit of Googling on them, and do a Venn diagram. Do a comparison of where their views are similar and different. So you still need to talk about whether it's on guilt or moral decision making or presence and absence of God and a compare. You still have to talk about the key themes within both arguments. So you still need to talk about rector ratio, synderesis, conscientia, vincible and invincible ignorance. You still need to talk about all of those things in relationship to guilt, in relationship to how their presence of God is there. You need to talk about how that's how you help with moral decision making versus Freud, who talks about the development of the superego after the ego and the id, how Freud talks about how the superego is developed and how conscience actually leads to bad things how the guilt leads to bad things rather than is a byproduct. So you need to know what both the men say and how Freud says it's an absence of God, Aquinas says there's a presence of God, how both of them argue that conscience is the moral decision making, one from the superego influenced by parents and external outside environment. Aquinas saying it comes from rector ratio and that that inner judgment that we all have. So you need to be able to know what each of the men says. Both of them argue it's moral decision making. Both of them argue to an extent it comes from something external. So rector ratio, having that right reason, conscientious synderesis, being able to make judgments, that has some influence from things like scripture, tradition, God, but you know it inside yourself. It's still your free will and your decision to take it on board or not. So there's a lot of similarities and differences between what they're both saying. As far as guilt is concerned, Freud argues that guilt is, you need to understand about what the superego is, the id and the ego. So the id comes first and it's your pleasure principle. As a baby, it's the want, need. I want it and I want it now. The ego starts to develop a little bit later where you start to learn from reward and punishment what you should and shouldn't do, what's acceptable, not acceptable. And then the ego comes in around the phallic Oedipus complex stages to around the age of 5. This is where the superego comes in. The superego takes charge. The superego organizes and conforms the ego and the id based on things like parental influence. So rather than it being God, it's parents. And so parents are schooling the environment that you're in. And so the superego is, guilt comes from your internal struggle with what you want and what you should do instead. So that's where guilt comes from, is this internal struggle kind of between your id and your ego, really, of I want to do this, but I can't. But then that guilt actually makes you behave worse. So that internal struggle between what you want and what you can't do actually makes it come out in bad behavior. So guilt makes you do bad things rather than comes as an after product. Whereas for Aquinas, guilt is, letting God down, that God's grace can lift this guilt that you've got, that it's not following your rector ratio, it's not following your conscience. Aquinas said above all else, you have to follow your conscience. And so guilt comes from not following your conscience. If you follow your conscience and you do something bad, Aquinas said as long as it's vincible or invincible ignorance, but Aquinas said you have to still follow your conscience, whatever your conscience tells you. And so sometimes bad things happen because of sensuality. That's where guilt can come into it, for example. I think most of you are having your own conversations at this point. Can we maybe keep your own convos for separate, just because then it confuses me and I can't help those of you that have questions for me. Yeah, superego is conscience. So conscience is part of your superego, correct? Yes, the judgy one. It is the judgy one. The superego is your judging one. Freud would, yes, I think that Freud is quite unclear when he says that guilt causes bad behavior. It's not a view that I would support. But what he's saying is that don't forget your id is things that you want, and so think about if your id is wanting you to kill somebody, but your ego is going, yeah, you can't really do that though, and so then you feel guilt for wanting to kill somebody because your ego is saying you can't, and then your superego starts to put pressure on you to, and it's that pressure, it's all this internal struggle that then makes you kind of start behaving and doing really bad things. So it's that guilt in that you're having this internal struggle that makes you behave in a bad way, rather than you kill somebody, you then feel guilty. So that's what Freud is arguing. Why does the superego judge the ego? That's just what the superego is. That's just the overriding controlling element of it. So the superego replaces the place of parents. So rather than your parents saying to you, as you get older, your parents aren't going to be there all the time to go, well, don't do that and you shouldn't do that. You at some point need to go, yeah, I shouldn't really do that. I shouldn't really get into that car when I've had a few drinks. I shouldn't really do that. You don't need a parent to constantly say, tell you what you should do. That's the job of the superego. Aquinas and guilt, I've just gone over that. I might have done it quickly, so go back and slow me down and pause me later on the live stream because it will be available later. Yeah, Freud and unconscious mind, that's just id, ego, superego, the different layers of the iceberg analogy. So that's fairly, Freud and unconscious mind, that's fairly straightforward. Do you have to know about Freud's psychosexual development? Briefly, to know that id's the first one that's in the oral stage, that the phallic stage or the Oedipus electric complex is where the superego starts. So it's just good to have an idea of where your id, ego, superego develops, but you don't have to know the ins and outs of the psychosexual stages. What can you say about Freud and the approach being unscientific? It's completely unscientific. There is no science behind Freud. Don't forget, Freud is superb. Freud is brilliant. He has been one of the founding fathers when it comes to psychology, understanding dreams and the way that we respond to things and our mind works, and totem and taboos and things like that. So he is absolutely brilliant with psychoanalysis, etc. But it's completely unscientific. There is no science behind Freud's arguments other than his own relationship potentially with his mother, and his few case studies who were his own clients, who he had relationships with. He took serious hardcore drugs. Yeah, there's no science, reliability, validity behind it. So you can criticize Freud for that. That's fine. When does the ego develop? The ego develops around kind of age of 3. So after your id, which is the first stage, is your ego develops, then your superego around the age of 5. So thank you, Ria, that's a really good question. Conscience is separate from unconscious mind or reason. Reason is Aquinas. So that's basically, again, if it's about separating from unconscious mind versus reason, that's examiner's way of saying Aquinas versus Freud. Aquinas supports reason. That's what rector ratio is. Rector ratio is right reason. So that's Aquinas versus Freud. Freud argues it's the unconscious mind. Freud argues unconscious mind. Aquinas argues it's based on reason. So that would be a Aquinas versus Freud question. Prediction for sex ethics. The predictions are all on the blog, so just check out the blog or watch the stream back a bit earlier. What points would you use about conscience being an umbrella term? Very, very good. Basically, on the spec, it talks about how it's based on how conscience maybe doesn't even exist, or how it's based on education. I think it mentions something about scripture. Let me just I've got the question and the wording here. Let me have a quick look. Make sure you check out the blog or the other video as well on the past gaps and the possible questions, because these are pretty much the wordings. That's what I've got here. These are the wordings that you could get asked. So you could get umbrella question on moral decision making, culture, environment, genetic predisposition, education. You again need to approach that from Aquinas or Freud. So basically, environment is how your superego develops, for example. Culture is how your superego develops. Education is how things like your superego. So it's, whereas Aquinas is more, you know it through right reason with a bit of influence from tradition and scripture. But whereas an umbrella term would be more of you could come at it from a Freud angle. Freud would support this, whereas Aquinas wouldn't really. For Aquinas, it's very straightforward. It's not an umbrella term. Conscience is conscientious synderesis. And so that's what Aquinas is saying, whereas Freud could be seen as more of an umbrella understanding because of all the different ways the superego is developed. Does Freud argue about the process of moral decision making? That's a great question. I don't think so. Aquinas definitely does, because that's what conscientia and synderesis is, which is why I think Aquinas' argument for conscience is very, very clever. So Aquinas specifically talks about how synderesis is the thought process and then conscientia is conscience in action. I don't know if Freud actually goes into it. He just says where conscience is and how the guilt can make you act in certain ways. So a Freud. And don't forget as well, your superego might be completely flawed, as in if you've grown up in a house with very warped morals, very warped understandings, that means that those outside influences could really influence and affect your superego as for what you see as right and wrong morally. So again, it's not this is why people do bad things as well, because your superego is not infallible. It's not perfect. It depends how you're outside. So whilst you might criticize the development of conscience from Aquinas because it's based something in kind of scripture and tradition and that understanding from God, you might criticize that. At the end of the day, Freud's superego is by far not perfect either, because once again, Aquinas, it comes from God. For Freud, it comes from parents. Both could be just as flawed. Rector ratio and synderesis. Synderesis applies rector ratio. Rector ratio is right reason. That's all rector ratio means. Rector ratio means right reason. Synderesis is the process of considering using your rector ratio. So it's the process of thinking, what should I not do? And then conscientia is acting upon that. Right, folks, we're about at the hour, so I will answer any final questions, but we are going to wrap this up just because you're going to have to go and do some research as far as your euthanasia case studies. Make sure you know what's happening on the BBC News. Make sure you know about homosexuality, premarital and extramarital sex. I've pretty much covered most of the areas that I wanted to with you all, but if there are any final questions I can answer, please let me know. How would you structure an essay based on guilt or the process of moral thinking? I would pick Freud or Aquinas as my structure, and then I'd keep my theme. So I think, right, for Freud, I need to talk about these three themes, and I'm going to link each of these three themes to guilt, and then compare it with Aquinas. So I'd always keep it nice and simple. So if I need to talk about guilt from Aquinas and Freud. If Aquinas is the first name in the question, Aquinas is then your structure. So you do Aquinas on guilt, then compare it with Freud. But just as I said, every part of the PowerPoint, every part of the teach along for conscience is all linked with guilt. It's linking it though in words, so it's saying how the superego is linked with guilt. It's about the iceberg and how that explains the superego and how that links to guilt, etc. So it might not be on guilt, it might be on moral decision making, but it's good to be prepared for that. So again, do a little bit of wider reading as well, because there's a little bit out there on guilt, but not a lot. Is it worth learning the stages of the development? Yes, hi Nick, just in relationship to the id, ego, superego. So id comes first, then the ego, then the superego around the Oedipus Electra stages. So I'd say that's all you need to know for them. Yep, I'll make sure the stream is available afterwards, Edward. That's no problem at all. Then you can slow me down and pause me, because I know I do talk quite fast. How can we argue that Kant supports sex ethics, homosexuality? Check out the video. There's a couple of slides. So check out the sex ethics teach along, because there's a couple of slides about how you can link Kant across, just because it's quite a big one to go through now. So there is a little bit online. Also, if you do have any other questions, please pop them underneath. I don't mind answering them afterwards as well. Conscientia is a quote as well as terminology. I would class that more as terminology than a quote. I think quotes need to be at least a couple of words, like moral law within for Kant. I count that as a quote, even though moral law is key terms, but moral law within is a quote. So I'd say one word, probably not a quote. Sometimes it is, but conscientia I won't class as a quote. Martha, I've gone over the teleological, deontological. So teleological is just situation ethics, utilitarianism. Deontological is natural law, Kant. So you just compare them theories. So it'd be one on each side and compare them. So I have mentioned that one earlier, though. Predicted questions are on the blog. Someone else mentioned Mackey's views for meta-ethics. Definitely, I don't quite recall what they are, but yes, I do remember seeing something in the textbook from Mackey. So yeah, definitely. If talk about other things that you've learnt as well. Right. What's a good quote for Aquinas? Freud. Check out the PowerPoint. There's a teach along for conscience. There's a good quote from Freud on the PowerPoint that talks about superego, having control over the ego. That's a good quote. And then for Aquinas, there's something about moral man making decisions, consciences. So there's a quote about the first slide. So double check the PowerPoint teach along for quotes, or just Google them. Public, private, I've already gone over. I think most of these questions now I've already gone over, or people can just look up separately. Oh, hello, hi. Yeah, no, it's yeah, this one's philosophy, but it's always nice to have people over from criminology. Is it better to do an easy question or a difficult question? Right, I'll just start finishing off some of these. As far as the questions you could get asked, an easy question, you have to work harder because more students will answer easy questions. A harder question, less students are going to answer it. So therefore, it'll be easier to get, there'll be less hoops you have to jump through to get those. Oh, sorry, wrong way. To get those higher marks. But at the end of the day, what you have to remember is, if you can only answer the easy questions, answer the easy questions. Looking at the philosophy paper, there was none of the questions that I would class as easy. I think all of them were difficult to their own or less extent. Aristotle's prime mover is quite tricky. Mentioning the fifth way and not just Aquinas' teleological was tricky. Anselm, as we've already said, was tricky. And I can't remember what the fourth, oh, Problem of Evil and Augustine, that one wasn't too bad, but all questions are easy if you know the answers to them. So I think with ethics, you're not necessarily going to get easy questions, because it really depends on what you're confident with. So I would just say go with the answers you are most confident with, rather than whether they're easy or difficult. So go with the ones that you can really excel on. Predictions are on the blog, or just watch this video, because I've talked about pretty much the questions I think that will come up. Right, folks, I'm going to finish this off, because I think I've pretty much answered most things. I think most of the questions that are coming through now are just repetitions from earlier things that I've said. So please feel free to rewatch the live stream again. I'll post it straight away afterwards. Please comment with any questions. Let me know again how ethics goes tomorrow. I'll be thinking of you all. You know, I'm really am there with you as far as, you know, the stress. So good luck with your revision tonight. Good luck in morning. Just show off. You are, you know, you are nearly there. Only one more after this one. One more, you know, just do everything you can tomorrow. No problem, everyone. Really, thanks for joining me tonight. And don't forget, I will do exactly the same next Monday. Oh, thank you. I will do exactly the same next Monday for your final one at 6 p.m. For Christian Thoughts. So I will see you all next Monday. But good luck tomorrow. Right. Thank you ever so much, everyone. Bye for now.